Welcome, everybody. My name is Craig Scott. I'm the Member of Parliament for Toronto-Danforth. I'm here with my colleague Randall Garrison, the MP for Esquimalt-Juan de Fuca. He's also the official opposition critic for LGBTQ issues and for public safety. Gary Kinsman, who's a leading authority and academic on the subject of today's press conference, the discriminatory discharge of LGBTQ members from the Canadian military. And Darl Wood, who herself was a serving member of the Canadian Armed Forces and was discharged from the military. We will hear her story shortly. I'll start with a few remarks in French before ending with a reference to a letter to the Defense Minister. Nous sommes ici pour demander au gouvernement d'offrir des excuses officielles aux membres de la communauté LGBT qui ont été renvoyés de façon discriminatoire des forces canadiennes, armées canadiennes au fil des décennies. J'ai déposé une motion, c'est le numéro M517, dans l'espoir de corriger cette faute historique et de dénoncer le traitement discriminatoire de ces Canadiens qui ont été jugés comme n'étant pas aptes à servir leur pays et à se sacrifier pour leur pays. Ma motion demande la tenue d'une enquête par l'ombudsman militaire au sujet des renvois des Canadiens LGBT, des forces armées canadiennes, au fil des décennies, en raison de leur orientation sexuelle ou de leur identité de genre. La motion vise à modifier le dossier pour y indiquer qu'ils ont rendu des services honorables à leur pays, au Canada, et à demander au gouvernement d'émettre des excuses officielles. The motion 517 that I tabled back in over basically a year ago, June of last year, tries to do several things. One, it asks for an official apology to those members of the Canadian Armed Forces that over the decades have been discriminatorily discharged or forced out in a way that does not reflect their actual service over the years, especially up until 1992 when a bit of a sea change occurred through the Charter of Rights, but not only because discrimination still played a role. The motion then demands that the Defense Minister use regulations at his disposal to instruct the military ombudsman to carry out an investigation of the shape of discriminatory discharges over Canada's military history, and to then recommend a mechanism for correcting the records of those who have been forced out of the military to reflect that they served their country honorably. Now, this motion will not be heard in this Parliament. We will be going to an election before it can be heard. I endeavored to draw the Defense Minister's attention to it in a letter in February to Minister Kenny saying the motion is a motion, but you already have the authority to act on this. An apology is due, and you are the one who can initiate the process for the military ombudsman to carry out the investigation and recommend the mechanism for correcting the records. Would you please do so? The letter is available in your package. The minister did do me the courtesy of replying to say he'd received the letter, but nothing more than that. So with that, I would now like to introduce Gary Kinsman. It is my great honor to introduce Gary, whose work in this area, including a book called The War on Queers by UBC Press, is groundbreaking. It documents in great detail the nature of the phenomenon that we're seeking historical recognition of. Gary.
Thanks, Craig. I'm speaking today on behalf of a newly formed network called We Demand an Apology Network. Our network brings together for the first time people who were directly affected by the national security campaigns to purge so-called homosexuals from the public service and the military, with supporters and researchers who believe an injustice was done. I refer people here in the media to our media package and the attached support statements from 6 people who are directly affected by these purge campaigns. At the same time as the Canadian government claims to be a firm supporter of LGBT rights on a world scale, it has still not come to terms with the anti-LGBT national security purge campaign in Canada that it was directly responsible for. This campaign led to surveillance on thousands of people and the destruction of the careers and livelihood of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people from the 1950s through to the 1990s. Identification as a confirmed homosexual meant the loss of employment and the denial of security clearances. People were watched, followed, interrogated, and purged from their jobs. Research indicates that the campaign against homosexuals also resulted in people taking their own lives. This was authorized at the highest levels of the Canadian state and was organized through its national security institutions, including the Security Panel, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, and the Canadian Armed Forces. This was an official campaign against thousands of people that was organized by the Canadian government. Homosexuals were defined as suffering from a supposed character weakness that supposedly led them to be open to blackmail from enemy agents. Research has shown that people who were interrogated and followed by the RCMP, CSIS, and the Canadian Forces felt that the only people who tried to blackmail them were the Canadian Security Forces themselves. They tried to force them to reveal the names of gay and lesbian armed forces members and public servants. In the Canadian military, there were prohibitions against so-called sex deviates, those with supposed sexual abnormalities, and homosexuals. Military security was directed to enforce both national security regulations against LGBT people and military regulations prohibiting homosexuals from being in the military for both national security and disciplinary reasons. In the public service, in 1960, the RCMP identified 360 confirmed and suspected homosexuals. By 1962, this had gone up to 850 people. In the public service, this campaign was extended into many areas having absolutely nothing to do with national security. The RCMP would approach people outside the public service and military to get them to inform on LGBT members in these institutions. They often threatened to lay criminal charges against these individuals unless they gave the names and identities of their LGBT acquaintances and friends. They were able to do this given the complete criminalization of homosexual practices until 1969 and the continuing criminalization of consensual homosexual sexualities that existed for decades after that. While these national security campaigns began to weaken in the public service by the mid-1980s, they continued at a high level of intensity in the RCMP, CSIS, and the military. The Purge campaign continued despite the MacDonald Commission report into the RCMP violations of people's rights in 1981, the enactment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, and the coming into force of the Equality Rights section of the Charter in 1985. In the military, the Purge campaign officially continued until 1992, but clearly there's been lots of problems since then as well. In the 1980s, hundreds of military members were discharged on these grounds of being suspected homosexuals. Violence against those identified and outed as gay or lesbian in the Canadian military was tolerated, if not encouraged, by the military hierarchy during these years. The military hierarchy very actively fought the ending of its exclusionary policies until it was forced to officially end these practices in the Michelle Douglas Supreme Court decision in 1992. Michelle Douglas and 4 others engaged in legal battles with the Canadian military at this time are the only people in Canada who have ever been recognized and redressed for these attempts to destroy their careers. In response to a question by NDP MP Sven Robinson in 1992, then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney stated that reports in the press about the Purge campaign would, quote, appear to be one of the great outrages and violations of fundamental human liberty that one would have seen for an extended period of time, end of quote. However, he did not call for an inquiry or offer an apology, and nothing ever came of this. It is now way past time for an official apology by the Canadian government to the hundreds, if not thousands, of people whose lives and careers were destroyed and harmed by these national security campaigns. This is why we welcome and strongly support the NDP motions 517 and 521 and Bill C-600, which Randall Garrison will speak about in a moment. We demand that the Canadian government apologize to all those who were directly affected by these national security purge campaigns and indicate that the Canadian state will not allow anything like this to ever happen again. This is an important step forward in opening the door for recognition and support for the thousands of people whose lives and careers were harmed by these government policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. I'd like to now introduce and call to the podium Darl Wood.
Sorry, my head's still in a fog from the airport, coming from the airport, so forgive me. Ursula Franklin has said, "It is hard to imagine one's own time as history." What a privilege it is to be here with the We Demand an Apology Network and the NDP so we can share our collective stories and concerns and ask for justice from the military and the government, but also for people in the public service who have lost their jobs. They say that when we speak from the heart, people listen. Well, I've been speaking out on this issue for 37 years, and no one in authority has heard. When Gary approached me to speak out one more time to share my own story with you today, I was hesitant to retell the experience of having been purged from the military for being lesbian. It is like ripping open an old wound in salt air. You know, after all these years, it never gets any easier. But I do it because it is important for us to recognize and remember, not only know how far we've come as an oppressed group, but also the journey and the depth of persecution we've experienced, and what is left to be done. In 1975, I was young and idealistic, and as corny as it sounds, I went into the military just wanting to serve my country and be part of something noble. I was 3 years into my military career when one morning I was called into my boss's office. I worked for the military police office orderly room at the time. That experience changed my life forever. That spring, many reports came across my desk about purges that were going on across the country. Each one made me ill and filled me with anxiety because I knew some of these people. I lived in constant fear of being found out, and now I was the one being asked into the office. I was accused of being a lesbian. I was then taken into custody by the Special Investigation Unit, where I was interrogated for hours and hours. In a small room, sitting on one of those wooden straight-back chairs, while 2 men grilled me about my sex life. They wanted to know how, who, when, where, and what we did in the privacy of our home and bedroom. Over and over for hours, isolating me from everyone, my loved one, my family of friends. I was young, scared, alone, and vulnerable. Do you know what the worst part was? It took me years to recognize what happened to me was a sexual assault. I was in total shock. That day, I lost my home, my career, my lover, and my family in one full sweep. Being victimized is coercive. They isolated me, they abused me, they blamed me, they discredited me, they left me with no resources to cope or to heal. They forced me actually to stay in that environment for 3 more months after the interrogation. And to add insult to injury, I was required to type my own release papers because it was a busy time in the orderly room. And because of the cult-like training in obedience, I didn't even think I could refuse. In subsequent years, I became an academic, a psychotherapist, and an activist to try to make sense of what happened to me, and more importantly, to heal from post-traumatic stress I suffered. After all this time, I still have flashbacks, sometimes nightmares, sleep problems, trouble concentrating, related bouts of anger, poor concentration, startled response tendencies, suicidal thoughts, disassociation, anxiety, and related physical ailments that can be directly attributed to both my military training and interrogation. All of this made it so hard to enjoy my life. It also affected my ability to maintain intimate relationships and long-time employment. Beginning with being part of the Federal Commission on Equity Rights in 1985, over the years I have consulted with members of Parliament, MLAs, Ombudsman, the Human Rights Commission, and many, many different lawyers, too many to remember them all. I've told my story on national and local radio and television, as well as featured in magazines, national magazines. I've still not gotten a fair treatment, a resolution, nor an apology. Apparently because it happened prior to the patriation of the Constitution and Bill of Human Rights. I've had no recourse. I still have no recourse. Neither have the thousands of other women and men from that period who continue, even today, to suffer from similar post-trauma stress. In 1985, I had hopes that the government would do the honorable thing. In essence, you stole the best years of my life. Now, as I once again speak from my heart, I ask that I will finally be heard, and you will do the right thing. Am I not owed, at the very least, an official apology? It was wrong, and when you do wrong, you apologize.
I'm Randall Garrison, Member of Parliament for Esquimalt-Juan de Fuca, and just say a couple of things. A year ago, we put together a package of measures to address the outstanding wrongs that have been done to our community, and these have sat on the order paper in Parliament for a year. And what we're doing now is approaching the government to say that even if they don't intend to deal with the motions or the bills, there's nothing that prevents them as ministers from doing what's right. And that's the essence of what we're asking for today for those who were thrown out of the military and given dishonorable discharges. Libby Davies would also like to have been with us today. She introduced a motion calling for a similar apology for public servants in the broader public service who were hounded out of public life. And Phil Toon, a Bill C-600, which would suspend criminal records for those who are convicted of things which are no longer a criminal offense in this country. So we have many, especially gay men, who were convicted of offenses that would not be illegal today, but they still bear the stigma of criminal records. So there's nothing to stop the government and the appropriate ministers from acting at this time. Probably for me, the one that's most close to my heart, of course, is Bill C-279, which calls for recognition of the rights of those who are transgender or gender variant. And that bill, of course, is being killed in the Senate as we speak. But once again, there's nothing that would prevent government ministers at this time from stepping up and doing the right thing, and at the very minimum, issuing an apology to those who were hounded out of public life and suffered some terrible consequences as a result of that. And we've just heard very powerful testimony from Darl Wood, and I thank her for the personal effort that it takes to do this once again. And I thank Gary Kinsman for the important work he's done in documenting what is an unbelievable chapter, a dark chapter in Canadian history.